let's begin with invocation. Right hand over the heart, left hand over the right hand, right thumb over left thumb, and spread the fingers. Head to the sky, and as it comes down, this is not my body. Chin to the left shoulder, and as it drifts across the chest, this is the temple of the heart. Toward the one, the perfection of love, harmony, and beauty, the only being, united with all the illuminated souls, who form the embodiment of the Master, the Spirit of guidance. Amen. So, I think I wrote all of you that it's been a tradition for Inayati Sufis since the 1920s to have a summer school, classes on specific subjects, just because in Western culture a lot of people are available during the summer to do sort of this sort of thing, and so it's been made as an opportunity for more intensive practices for Inayati Sufis and to study different things together. And so I thought we might as well do the same and spend some time this summer, a few different classes, studying a text called The Way of Illumination by Hazrat Inayat Khan. And I guess Eunice here wants to be on video. Cutest dog ever, by the way. And The Way of Illumination is a small book that is usually found in volume 1 of the message series of Hazrat Inayat Khan's collected works. And The Way of Illumination is comprised of articles that were in what was probably the first Sufi journal. I believe it was called Sufi. And it was a quarterly journal that was published between 1915 and 1920. And Hazrat Inayat Khan was the chief editor and the chief contributor. And so all of the pieces that are in The Way of Illumination were articles which we believe he wrote, or transcriptions of talks that he gave that were then collected up and made into a small book published, in the 20s called The Way of Illumination. And so through the summer I want to pick at least 4 or 5 pieces from The Way of Illumination and give commentary on them. And so since it's the start of something, I thought I'd start with the article that was called Sufism, which is apparently the way he wanted to present Sufism in these early years of his teaching. 1915 he would have been. He would have been in his early 30s and had only been in the West from 1910. He left India in 1910 and came to the United States and met his first student in 1911, and then went over to the UK and France and gave these teachings. So he's only been in the West a very short time when he gave these teachings. So we'll begin with Sufism. The word Sufi is from a Persian word meaning wisdom. From the original root, many derivations can be traced. The Greek Sophia is a striking instance. Now, right off the bat, this is interesting if not problematic. Because because I don't actually know of any Persian derivation for the word Sufi. In fact, there's pretty much strong agreement that it comes from Arabic. The Arabic words upon which it may be based are sufa, meaning a bench or a couch, safa, meaning pure or purity, or suf, meaning wool. And knowledge of linguistics tells us that the derivation is almost certainly suf, wool. Though many Sufis are fond of safa, pure. But almost certainly comes from suf, wool. And Hazrat Inayat Khan would know this. And so it's very interesting that he says the word Sufi is from a Persian word meaning wisdom. On the one hand, that's probably not true, from what we know linguistically. On the other hand, he was a genius of remarkably broad knowledge, and so he's probably referring to something that he knows that we do not know. And I think the solution to this issue comes from his following sentence. From the original root, many derivations can be traced. The Greek Sophia is a striking instance. Okay, so this is interesting too. In terms of language families from which we get our various languages, Persian or Farsi comes from the Indo-European language families, and then it goes into Indo-Iranian and then becomes Farsi. But from Indo-European we get, Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, Farsi, and you see a lot of common roots. Well, the roots are all common, but you see a lot of common words. Theus, Deus, Deva, all words for God, in different Indo-European languages. But Arabic is a Semitic language, comes from a different language family. Not that they probably don't all come from an original source, but often it's much more difficult to find a connection between a Semitic word and an Indo-European word. So the word Sufi is from a Persian word meaning wisdom. From the original root, many derivations can be traced. The Greek Sophia is a striking instance. I don't know what the Farsi or Persian for wisdom is, but there is an Indo-European root that is basically a triliteral root, which would be like SPI. And all the words that come off of that root would have those kind of characteristics to it. And in Greek, coming off of that Indo-European root, we get sophos. Sophos means wise. And from it we get Sophia, wisdom. You can also see it in Latin with sapiens, meaning knowledge or intelligence. Homo sapiens, the intelligent human. So that's SPI, that triliteral root shows up there also. So I think what he's wanting to say is he's tracing an Indo-European root for Sufi also that means wisdom, and this is what he wants to emphasize. Because as a teacher, teachers always use, everything is in some ways hermeneutics. or rather, everything is kind of about how are you going to get the message across. So not necessarily interpretation, but how are you going to get the message across? And you use anything to get it across. So I'm guessing that the message that he wants to get across in this instance is building upon an idea of Sufism as being related to wisdom. I don't think that he thinks that this is the only route. I think it's the one that he wants to use to teach on that given day. And he has an idea of how you can trace Sufism to this Indo-European route. And with his superior knowledge of Farsi, I bet he could say what it was, but he just didn't happen to here. And so I think this is borne out in the next paragraph. Wisdom is the ultimate power. In wisdom is rooted religion, or that is to say, religion is rooted in wisdom. Religion itself connotes law and inspiration. So this is kind of a formula, that out of wisdom comes religion, which equals law plus inspiration. So religion tells you what you must do. And what you must do, according to religion, comes out of inspiration, meaning an inspired text, revelation, something that is infused with spirit, inspiration. The indwelling of spirit rose up and offered this wisdom, which told us what to do. And he's saying that's a definition of religion here. But the point of view of the wise differs from the simple followers of a religious faith. Whatever their faith, the wise have always been able to meet each other beyond those boundaries of external forms and conventions, which are natural and necessary to human life, but which nevertheless separate humanity. So going back, he shows us that religion is born out of wisdom and, exists according to that formula, inspiration plus what to do equals religion. And that what to do is based out of revelation and inspiration. But then he goes back and says, but if we step back prior to just the wisdom itself, then the boundaries that are created by the religious life fall away. And we come back to the source wisdom. So whatever their faith, the wise have always been able to meet each other beyond those narrow boundaries of external forms and conventions, which you have in religion. Because religion is a culture. It's going to have very specific characteristics. Anything that evolves a special characteristic. A tight community, a language, which allows it to express very directly, but also limits it. Now, he wants to say that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not a bad thing. He says, whatever their faith, the wise have been able to meet each other beyond those narrow boundaries of external forms and conventions. So that makes it sound like it's a little bad. It's just constraining. He says, but those things are natural and necessary to human life. We need language. We need these expediencies that help us get something across. We just don't want to get stuck in them. They're natural and necessary to human life, but which nevertheless end up separating us. So he's clearly wanting to derive Sufism from wisdom here for the purpose of teaching about how wisdom underlies all of our spiritual traditions. People of the same thought and point of view are drawn to each other with a tendency to form an exclusive circle. People who are vibing, people who have an affinity, will resonate with one another and have a tendency always to create an exclusive circle. A minority is apt to fence itself off from the majority and from the crowd. So it has been with the mystics. As mystical ideas are unintelligible to many, the mystics have, therefore, usually imparted their ideas only to a chosen few, to a picked band who they trust and who were ready for initiation and discipleship. So it's kind of funny. It's like he's talking about the wisdom that is underneath the boundaries and surpasses the boundaries, but then talks about even among the mystics, there's still a tendency to create boundaries and circles. And that it's a natural thing. Since it's difficult to convey mystical ideas, it's necessarily limited in who is going to be drawn to them. And as the Sufis, in the early period found out, they were persecuted pretty quickly for the broadness of their ideas and the complexity of their ideas, which were not understood in general and therefore misunderstood and got them persecuted. So there's some necessity, again, to contraction and expansion. Even the ones that are expanded in their mystical states and ideas have to participate in the worldly reality of contraction and having boundaries too. So he's not saying that there's boundarylessness and boundaries, and boundarylessness and expansion is good and boundaries are bad. No, it's just they're relative states. So the mystics have therefore usually imparted their ideas to a chosen few only. And it's because it requires discernment. You can't burst someone's paradigm. Or rather, you can, but it's dangerous to do so. My teacher, Reb Zalman, told me once how when he was a university professor at Temple University, a man knocked on his office door, and he was a religious Jew who had, religious Orthodox Jew who was now having all these questions about, how do I marry science to my Orthodox view, and was struggling with these questions. And so he comes to see Reb Zalman, who's known for answering these questions, and very enthusiastically, Reb Zalman started to lead him through, how you could marry these things and how paradigms shift over time, and the paradigm of Judaism is shifted over time. And once we believe this, and now we can expand it to believe this. And he took him on a tour of a mystical universe that would integrate all of these ideas and solve all of his problems. And the guy thanked him, shook his hand, and left. And a week later, the guy knocks on his door again. And he opens the door, and the guy is angry. And he says, "Shegitz, bastard." And really had retreated back into the most, locked Orthodox view. And was angry at Reb Zalman, for misleading him. And what Reb Zalman realized from that was that you can't take anybody on a journey they're not ready for. That he didn't do enough discernment with where this guy was really at. He may have been struggling, but he needed to be led very slowly. And he took him too fast And it caused a reaction which threw him back into his safe world because he'd been taken out of his world of safety. He may have been ready to start to challenge it, but he was not ready to go out into the wide world. And once he got out there, it terrified him, and he retreated and reverted to a simpler model. And so this guy was more stuck than he was before, after being shown, you know, the so-called things that he should have been shown. So, kitty, don't drink my water. So, you know, this is behind this idea of imparting only to a chosen few because it requires discernment. It requires discernment. Who you talk to, how you talk to them. It's not just, you know, the teaching. The teaching is, you know, this is what you need to know. Everybody needs to know what they need to know, and in their time. And this is, you know, this story about Reb Zalman is in full agreement with Hazrat Inayat Khan's own notion around these things. And we'll see it in the end of this teaching, that you don't need to disturb where somebody's at. Don't really need to. But speak to those who are ready. Who are ready for initiation, which means, you know, entry onto a path, and discipleship. And, you know, in the root of discipleship is discipline. Who are ready to practice something with discipline and focus. And the word discipleship is actually important. I remember I was TA for my teacher Reb Zalman, and the class was on spiritual disciplines and resources. And I noticed something among all the people that were in the class. You know, and Reb Zalman, we would drive home together at night, and he'd say, you know, he says, "What did you notice today?" I said, "It occurred to me that everybody in the class wants to be a teacher, and they've never been disciples. And what you have then is somebody who is ripe for abuse, for power. They've never traveled the path of discipleship. They've never humbled themselves. They've never been a simple learner. They've never, you know, done the work of discipleship. Not only is it problematic, you know, to desire to be a teacher in the first place, but then when you've never been a disciple, you don't know what one is. And so how are you going to treat those people that look to you and project upon you their ideals, which is already problematic, and you've never been one of them? You're almost certainly going to take advantage of them. And so it is a path of initiation and discipleship. Thus, great Sufis have appeared at different times and founded different schools of thought. Different schools of thought because they formed different circles, different small cultures. Their expression of wisdom has differed to suit their environments, but their understanding of life has been one and the same. So, like any culture, it develops characteristics that express in a particular language. But the wisdom is basically the same. Comes out different, but you'll find the commonalities. The same herb planted in various atmospheric conditions will vary in form accordingly, but retain its basic characteristics. And, you know, we see that scientifically, you know, that's the basis of being able to identify plant life. You know, these all belong to the same family because they share these characteristics, but in this environment it grows and looks like this, in this environment it looks a little differently. Still shares these characteristics, which is why we put it in that family. co-teacher. The European historian, and now you have to imagine that he's just meeting European historians for the first time. And he's talking to them about Sufism. And these would still be the early historians of religion. And I have to say that they were remarkable scholars. This early generation of historians of religion, though ignorant in terms of experience often with the religions about which they would speak, were remarkable scholars with great mastery of languages and the origin of languages, and a great breadth of knowledge, and I still admire that generation of scholars. So I'm not going to be disparaging of them. And he's meeting some people from that generation. He's speaking about them now. They're often remarkably wrong, by the way, but to be admired for what they were doing in their day. The European historian sometimes traces the history of Sufism by noticing the actual occurrence of this word and by referring only to those schools of thought which have definitely wished to be known by this name, those who self-identify as Sufis, and then identifying the derivation of the word from those groups who identified as such. So that's what we're talking about with Sufa, Safa, Suf. So Sufa, bench, we thought, for those who derived the word Sufi from Sufa, they thought that perhaps the word Sufi came from the people of the bench, the people in the time of the Prophet Muhammad who were exceptionally devotional and never left the bench outside of the mosque, the original mosque in Muhammad's time. And they were always hanging out there. They couldn't get enough of prayer. They were always talking about God, God intoxicated, and were always on the bench. And you know, this was a historical group of people, the companions of the Prophet, and there was some thought that Sufi came from Sufa. And then the other possible derivation that many Sufis talked about was Safa, meaning pure. They wanted to take on a path of becoming pure, purifying. And purification was tasawwuf. That's the actual word for Sufism, because Sufism is just an anglicized word. In Arabic, it's tasawwuf, Sufism, which means purifying, purification. And so there's a sense in which that's true. The Sufism means purification. But we know historically that almost certainly, historically and linguistically, that almost certainly it comes from Suf, wool. And they did not name themselves, but they got this name because people pointed at them and laughed and called them the wool wearers. Many groups get named pejoratively by other people outside of that group. In Judaism, the Hasidim, it was again a case of people pointing at them, the pious ones, the pious ones. You can see, you know. But they were. It turned out to be accurate. And it was accurate in this case too. They wore wool. The early Sufis wore wool, which was both a political and a spiritual statement. To wear wool in the arid desert environment was an ascetic act. It's uncomfortable, it's hot, it's a little rougher on the skin. And they were setting themselves against the model of the increasingly wealthy elite in the Islamic Empire, who were more and more wearing cotton, becoming richer, they could afford better. And they wanted to say, we want to, they actually would say, they wanted to take the model of Isa al-Masih, Jesus the Messiah, who wore wool, they would say. And this was because they were looking at the example of Christian desert ascetics who were wearing wool, and they thought this is the model of what a spiritual practitioner should be. In the desert cave, you know, holding on to the spiritual values, not looking for luxury. So these early Sufis wore wool for this reason. And so Sufi meant the wool wearers. And it was both political and spiritual because they saw the Islamic Empire becoming decadent. And they wanted to set themselves against that decadence and show that they believed only in the most spiritual values. And Isa, or Jesus, in the Islamic tradition has always represented the most spiritual model, the least worldly model. It wasn't a lack of respect for the Prophet Muhammad. That was in no way would be the case. But as they would see it, the Prophet Muhammad had to, in his time, be everything to all people. He had to be political leader. He had to be administrator. He had to deal with worldly things. And so they didn't want to make that their model. They wanted to separate from the world because they were ascetics, the earliest Sufis at least. So there's basis for this understanding of where Sufism comes from. Some European scholars find the origin of this philosophy in the teaching of Islam. Others connect it with Buddhism. Others do not reject as incredible the Semitic tradition that its foundation is to be attributed to the teachings of Abraham. So we've just discussed the origins in Islam. Some scholars see some connection with Buddhism, and there is some connection. There were contacts between early Sufis and what would be latter-day Buddhists in Central Asia. Some Buddhists that still survived there. There were still some Buddhist monasteries that hadn't been eliminated yet in Central Asia. And there were contacts between these Sufis and Buddhists. I wouldn't put the origins in Buddhism, but there was certainly influence, to my mind. And then he says, and there are some that don't reject entirely the idea that Sufism could go back to the time of Abraham, some sort of primordial spiritual tradition. Now this statement is, the next statement is just as interesting as deriving Sufi from a Persian word meaning wisdom. He says, but the greater number consider that it arose contemporary to the teachings of Zoroaster, or Zarathustra. I don't know anybody who thinks that. Now, he was having direct conversations. This is probably not coming from his reading. He's having direct conversations with these scholars who probably see him as a fascinating specimen because many of them have not traveled to India or to Afghanistan. They're meeting a Sufi for the first time. He was really the first Sufi in the West. And so they're both having a fascinating conversation with another specimen of almost another species, you know? He's talking to them and trying to learn what they are, and they're talking to him and trying to learn what he is. And so these kinds of statements he's making are coming probably directly from these conversations. So many consider that it arose contemporary to the teachings of Zoroaster, Zarathustra, the founder of Zoroastrianism, this Persian religion, which is very early. Every age of the world has seen awakened souls, and as it is impossible to limit wisdom to any one period or place, so it is impossible to date the origin of Sufism. What I suspect he means with regard to Zoroaster and Zoroastrianism is that he may see some of the earliest origins for Sufism in Zoroastrianism, in many of its teachings. And he may have seen how these trickled through the centuries to produce an influence on Persian culture that flowered in Sufism. And among the Persian Sufis, it's clear that Zoroastrian teachings, which were just in the very soil in which they lived, which were apparently eradicated when Islam came in, were not really eradicated, because it's almost impossible to kill anything like that. It just goes somewhere else and it seeps in, you know. One culture comes in and it looks like it's suppressed another culture, only to find that it's been tainted with that culture over time. So it's in the soil. You know, a Persian thinks like a Persian thinks. It's got generations upon thousands of years of ideas. They can't even understand the new ideas that come in except through the interpretive device of their old ideas. So you say Islam means this, and you think that you're making your point, you know, coming as an Arab from the Arabian Peninsula. But what they're hearing is, they're hearing what you're saying about Islam in terms of their Zoroastrianism. You have to speak their language. And even if you don't, they're going to hear it in their language to some degree. And so what he's suggesting is there are primordial Zoroastrian ideas that in the Persian culture suffused their Islam and the Sufism that grew up there. Because while Sufism may have had its earliest origins in Islam, it really flowers as it comes into Afghanistan and Persia. And then we get to highly influential Sufis like Yahya Suhrawardi, who is the founder of the Ishraqi school of Sufism, which means the illuminationist school, where all the teachings are about light and illumination. And it is extremely clear to us, it's historically clear, that his Sufism was infused with these Zoroastrian ideas. And it made a beautiful fusion of kind of Islamic Sufism with a Zoroastrian Sufism, you might say, or it made a fusion Sufism that was both. So I think that's what he's referring to here. And then he wants to go back to his wisdom point. Every age of the world has seen awakened souls, and it is impossible to limit wisdom to any one period or place, and so it is impossible to date the origins of Sufism. Implicit in that is that anybody who has been an awakened soul is a Sufi. Anyone who is wise is a Sufi. We could limit it to this historical, phenomenon that comes out of Arabia and into Central Asia, and those ones that self-identified as Sufis. He says, but actually among Sufis, there has always been a primordial teaching that all of the wise are Sufis. And whenever there was awakened consciousness, there was Sufism, whether it was identified as such or not. Not only have there been illuminated souls in all times, but there have been periods when a wave of illumination passed over humanity as a whole. He's talking about an axial age. My teacher Reb Zalman would talk about the axial age, or the different axial ages, like a blip on the mind of global consciousness, like something lit up, and across humanity in different cultures, something lit up and activated. And so the axial age that's usually talked about is the period when we get Confucius and Lao Tzu and the Buddha, and that's the same period in which we get the prophetic consciousness in Judaism. Something happened around a little band of time that created it was just like a leap in consciousness in the way religion's expressed. Out of the prophets in Judaism, you get a sense of moral outrage against decadence and how society is not right, and there has to be a sense of divine justice to right things. You're not taking care of your poor or your widows, and that's the prophetic consciousness that comes in Judaism in that period. And then we get the Buddha, and we get Confucius. It's amazing. And it was the philosopher Karl Jaspers who coined this term, Axial Age, to start to deal with historically understanding what could have happened to create this jump in consciousness. And people still talk about the Axial Age because whatever we think actually was happening to create that, it's hard to deny that it actually happened. It's an observable fact that those things happened in the same period, roughly the same period. What accounts for it, whether it was an infusion of God breath into the planet, we don't know, but it happened. So a wave of illumination passed over humanity as a whole. Isn't it interesting that in the previous paragraph, he's talking about Zoroastrianism, which is all about illumination, light and darkness. A wave of illumination passed over humanity as a whole. We believe that such a period is now at hand. So this talk would have been given between 1915 and 1920. The calamity through which the world has lately passed. So that means World War I. So that would put this talk, if it's past, then we're in late 1918, this is probably between 1918 and 1920. So we believe that such a period is at hand, where a wave of illumination is now coming across the planet. The calamity through which the world has lately passed and the problems of the present difficult situations are due to the existence of boundaries. This fact is already clear to many. Sufism takes away the barriers which divide different faiths by bringing into full light the underlying wisdom in which they are all united. Now, he's not wrong. World War I, what's it called? World War I. World War I. It seemed like a new phenomenon. The world seemed to be at war. It was crossing vast regions. There were all kinds of different players. And in some ways, he's suggesting there's a connection between the scale of war and how it's happening across cultures now. It's just not one-to-one. With that is also the related parallel possibility of crossing boundaries spiritually and global consciousness. We're now capable of global war. Global consciousness is also possible. We've lately passed through this calamity, and now other cultures are now in contact with one another and talking. Even the colonialist situation that puts the British in India and in Africa also had interesting effects. On the one hand, it's colonialism and it's terrible. On the other hand, among the British, you always had some highly educated, Oxford educated person who's put in an administrative position in India because at Oxford they had been a specialist in Urdu and in learning Hindi and Sanskrit. They were often highly educated scholars that got put in administrative posts in faraway India and often wanted to go to those places. And often people like that, or at least it happened a number of times, as the British would say in that period, went native. You know, their curiosity led them into, you know, the quarters of town where nobody went, or led them into the Himalayas where they met a yogi and they started to learn with them. And those people, these administrative, you know, sometimes they were high court judges, you know, sometimes they were, you know, some sort of other military official, and they became the first translators of Hindu tantras, Sufi texts, you know, the ones that were in Afghanistan. We have all of our, or at least a lot of the early translations come from these folks who were from the colonialist situation. And then you look at things like, you know, what unites India and the disparate Indian states to throw out the British? You know, the British united them. Railroads and a common language. They did not have, they spoke different languages. Each state was highly differentiated. Common language of English and railroads helped unite the Indians to throw out the British. They became one people. So it's an interesting thing that the negative is interrelated with the positive possibility. They can't be extricated. You know, we can only kind of call one bad, you know, from a perspective, just knowing it's a perspective. But in the larger whole, it serves an end, or at least seems to serve an end. Now he's saying that in that period in which he was living, something was opening up for the possibility of the unity of all religions. That there was a blip on the global brain. And if you think of the Axial Age in which you have Confucius, the Buddha, and, you know, the Hebrew prophets, it's a band of time that is 200 to 300 years. And so, you know, we're really only seeing the opening of these possibilities probably from the 1850s, the earliest, and then moving forward into our time. But it's coming quicker and quicker. Where we're seeing the commonalities between religions, seeing the commonalities between all humans. The idea of race is breaking down entirely, you know. We're understanding these things, but, you know, genetics is revealing this. We're in one of those periods. This fact is already clear to many. Sufism takes away the barriers, this is what we read before, which divide different faiths by bringing into full light the underlying wisdom in which they are all united. We recognize as Sufis all those groups who are working with the aim of uniting humanity. That's a Sufi aim. If you do that, you're a Sufi. We welcome any who sympathize with this object. And if many of these souls have limited ideals, our ideal does not oppose or attempt to break down their ideals. So, if somebody's working with you, and even if their notions of, you know, of universality are more limited, or they don't even do that, but they're working toward that end, our ideals embrace not criticizing necessarily theirs, or making them bad. For we believe that our ideal is in the depth of every soul, and sooner or later we must touch that depth in many or all. Although humankind is easily influenced by emotions of hatred or prejudice and can be quickly stirred to rebellion and bloodshed, yet the love of amity and harmony is more infectious still. Through all periods of tyranny and oppression, of injustice and revolution, what the world really seeks is peace. It is true that not everyone knows for what they are really seeking or what they're really looking for. It doesn't mean they're not looking for it, just because they don't know what they're looking for. We reach out, you know. Our motivating force reaches out, like the Baal Shem Tov in Hasidism would say, you know, even lustful desire is just a limitation or warping of the basic desire for union, to be reunified. The base knowledge of union, trying to re-achieve union, because it's become separated. And you can have limited or more expansive forms of this desire for union. So not everyone knows what they're really looking for, but it doesn't mean they're not looking, they're not reaching out. They reach out naturally. It's an inborn desire to move toward those things. They wait to be told even what they're looking for. But when the truth is told to them, they have difficulty recognizing it. Now, this is a fact that every good teacher needs to recognize, that you cannot give people the answers. And this is what Reb Zalman found with that man that came to him. You can't give people the answers. The best teaching leads people up to the answers. It's only the things we discover for ourselves that have deep impact. You know, your own awakening to the idea. Every soul has a definite task. The fulfillment of this individual purpose can alone lead one aright. Illumination comes through the medium of one's own talent or ability. Joseph Campbell would have said, follow your bliss. Every soul has a definite purpose. Now he's making a connection here. Every soul has a definite purpose. Illumination comes through the medium of one's own talent. The purpose is not hard to find. We think it's hard to find, but it's simple. You light up. The things over which you light up announce your purpose. It's not hard. Now another chapter in this book is on life's purpose, and I gave a commentary on this. It's online now, and that's all about this. He spends a lot of time talking about how people are searching for purpose when it's right in front of you. The confusion we have is like trying to make $1 out of it. Oh, how am I going to make money from that? How am I going to feed myself from that? They're not related. That is a problem for you, how you're going to feed yourself. That's a problem for you. Your purpose does not care. On your purpose, no matter what. You feed yourself however you're going to. But the purpose says, do that, do that, do that. And you do have to solve the problem of eating and living. But if you want to be on your purpose, spend time in that light. Do that thing. So he's saying, that's not hard. Look where you love. You want to find your purpose? Look where you love. Illumination comes through the medium of one's own talent. So there's maybe a little discernment there. Both the things that you love, but also the things that you can do. Why can you do them? You know, you have specific abilities other people don't have. You know, why can you do them? It's at least worth wondering, is there a purpose for that gift? How can I use it for others? And if I don't use it, is it a waste? Is it a waste of my purpose? Is it a waste of my being? Now, it doesn't mean you need to use it in a conventional way, according to a definition of society. You know, you're good at math, so you become one of these conventional things that society thinks what a person who has that ability does. That's also neither here nor there. What does that have to do with it? But if you were to take that ability and put it to what you love, if it's not the same thing, if it's not already overlapping completely, you might see. By taking one's own particular line in life, one fits into the scheme of the whole. By following your own thread, your thread contributes to the whole fabric. And thus one attains one's own goal by fitting our thread into the fabric of the whole. And that reaches, not only our personal goal, but it contributes to the whole and the goal of the whole, as it were. People must first create peace in themselves if they desire to see peace in the world. Which reminds me of Confucius from the Analects, where he says, wanting good government in their region, they realize they must first learn to govern their own household. Wanting peace in their house, they needed to learn to govern themselves. You want peace in the government? Look to your house. If you're going to govern your house, you find that the major problem in it is you. You don't know how to govern yourself. Learn to govern yourself. It's a simple principle. Wanting peace in the world, they must first create peace in themselves. What are you going to contribute in terms of peace in the world if you don't have any in yourself? What lesson can you impart if you don't know it, know that lesson? And so, this is the difference between activism and sacred activism, maybe. Because activism without a real shift in consciousness is blindness. And we've seen this many times, historically. The early communists in Russia had something to say about injustice, and they were right. But they just reproduced it. They just became another tyrannical elite. There was not a real consciousness shift. It was just an out-and-out rebellion against something that was wrong, but they just became the oppressor. In fact, a more insidious oppressor, because they were so self-righteous. So, with sacred activism, the idea is that the activism is born of what you learn from the Spirit. It becomes immediately obvious that this doesn't work. The activism comes from there, not the other way around. It's just intelligence to know something's wrong. But if we're going to do something about it in a skillful way, we have to deal with ourselves and how we reflect that wrong ourselves. Because we're just microcosms of the whole. If we see a wrong out there, it probably exists in us. And are we just projecting the fixing of the external one, our internal problem on the fixing of the external problem? And then if we haven't addressed it in ourselves, what we just end up doing is reproducing it out there in another form. For lacking the peace within, no effort of theirs can bring any permanent result. Now it is the knowledge of the self that gives knowledge of humanity. We only know humanity through getting to know ourselves. We look at our own motives and desires, and we recognize they exist everywhere else. And in the understanding of the human being lies the understanding of nature, which reveals the law of the whole creation. The knowledge of the self is therefore the essential knowledge. This cannot, however, be attained by study alone, although study is important. It is by following the path of meditation that the initiate arrives at the realization of self. And meditation is broader here. He does mean a tranquility breath practice, etc. But he also means meditation in the older sense, meaning what we would call contemplation. Meditation, or from the Latin root, meditatio means to measure out thought, parse it out, be able to look at it. By reflection, reflective awareness, reflective consciousness, reflecting on our situations, meditating on them. What is the self? What is a human being? What does it mean to be alive? We can study, and that's good. But meditation of both sorts, contemplation and what we would call meditation, are another aspect. And in some ways he's saying these are the two essentials. Study, learn, then do the internal study. So it's in some ways kind of like objective study and subjective study. In this state, one does not regard another as a friend or foe, but as oneself. To know oneself is to know humanity, and not what we usually do. Everybody is other, I'm right, others are wrong. I'll point out what's wrong with you, but not what's wrong with myself. But to really know the self is to know everybody has the same foibles and problems, and when you look at it in somebody else, you know that also exists in you. We're constantly cutting ourselves off from the rest of creation. It's a ridiculous irony. The most obvious one is when we talk about nature, as if we weren't nature. It's like nature trying to talk about itself as something other. We're just an outgrowth of that. It's like a hair growing out of my arm, talking about that thing, the body, It's like, how do we talk about nature as other? It's ridiculous. But we do it, and there's an obvious reason why we do it. Because we have this kind of awareness and consciousness. But it both isolates itself and in its capacity for analysis and looking out, it forgets that it can't get outside of that. And it's only when we remember that we can't get outside of it that we have any wisdom. Because the wisdom is in unknowing, knowing what you don't know. And that always creates a bigger awareness. When one knows the self, then one is able to hold the reins of the self in the hand. One has the mastery of one's own life, a control which develops in time into a hold upon life in general. So one of his big teachings is on mastery, learning mastery. But that begins with learning to discipline oneself, learning to know oneself. Mastery in life begins with self-mastery. And so what comes next shows that this was probably an oral talk, because they also have in it question and answers from the group that was there. And I find the questions as revealing as the answers. The questions tell us who was sitting there. It's fascinating. So a questioner says, and I'll say more about this, but a lot of the people, especially in Europe, who came to Hazrat Inayat Khan were people of leisure. They were already from elite classes. They would have been the liberals of their day, but they had a certain experience of life, that came from living an elite life, which gave them the leisure to pursue this kind of liberal spirituality, to look at other religions. And they were cultured, and they wore suits, and collars, and it was a salon culture of elite classes. Those were the first people they could talk to, because they were only the people that had time to talk to him, or meet with him, or invite him into their circle because he was a novelty. So at so-and-so's villa, we'll invite the Indian classical musician. Nobody's ever heard Indian classical music, and he'll play for us, and he'll give this talk. You can see what the social situation is, right? He's talking to these people. And in some ways, who he was talking to shaped the early form of Inayati-Sufism. And one of my arguments is that we have to recognize that and liberate Inayati-Sufism from who he was talking to in the beginning, because we can't use that language today. He's talking to a salon culture. So one of them says, I've never heard of any Sufism which is not definitely Islamic, nor of any Sufi who did not accept the Quran as the final revelation. Is the Sufi order really Muslim? Now he's just given a talk that pretty much says no, but this person's stuck there. In fact, he went out of his way to not limit it to Islamic Sufism. He says, this is his answer. There is one holy book, the sacred manuscript of nature, the only scripture which can enlighten its reader. So this person, it says, I've never met a Sufi who didn't accept the Quran. He says there is one holy book, the sacred book of nature, the only scripture that can enlighten its reader. Nature, all of being, is our real teacher. That's the true manuscript that we need to read. Read the landscape, read the earth, read your experience of the planet. That's the one scripture. And this statement that he makes as an answer is word for word his the third of his 10 remembrances. The first, there's one God, the only being, nothing else exists. There's one God, the only being, nothing else exists. The third one is this: there is one holy book, the sacred manuscript of nature, the only scripture that can enlighten its reader. So he makes the broadest possible statement. The Quran, from the beginning to end. Now this is a Muslim Sufi. He is a Muslim Sufi. He grew up a Muslim. He's not saying that he's not a Muslim. He's saying that Sufism is not limited to that at all. The Quran, from beginning to end, points to nature as the testimony of the truth it contains. And it's true, it does. The Quran is constantly saying, it's constantly talking about ayat, signs. As a statement from God, it will say, you know, by the tree at the furthest limit, I testify that this is a true teaching. By the sacred river as it passes through the earth, I testify that this is the truth. By the rock as it stands, the Quran is constantly making these oath statements by what it would call the signs of God in nature. And what it means is that it's like, you know, somebody would come up to you and, you know, and they would question what you're saying. And you would say, you know, by this rock next to me, I testify that it's the truth. And it's like saying, like, by this thing that is so solid and sacred and, you know, full of the most real reality, how could what I would be saying be not true? What the Quran, in doing that, is trying to say is that when it says, I testify that this is true by this sign, this rock, or this river, or this forest, it's saying, can't you see that everything is divine? It's obvious. If you looked closely at the rock, if you look closely at the river, if you look closely at the sky, it's obvious that everything is divine. It just believes that. It just assumes that that's true. And there's a power to that. If we were to really look, wouldn't it be obvious? If we really look at ourselves, if we really look at another human being, really look at them, and explore what a tremendous mystery they are, it would open up to divinity. It would be obvious how remarkable, how miraculous everything is. And the Quran just assumes it. It's just saying, by this sign, by this ayah, it's obvious, you know, that God is. Your only problem then is how you might limit God. But we don't have to look very far for the mystery. It's everywhere. Scratch the surface of anything and you'll find the mystery. It's our sense of knowing that limits us. But if we have true curiosity, we'll find like there's an underlying mystery behind all the things that we know. We just mostly think we know. So he's saying the Quran is pointing to nature all the time. So he just made the statement that the real scripture is nature. All being is what he means by that. And even the Quran points this out. The seers to whom the truth has been revealed have read it in the book of nature. All those prophets that have come with religions have only read the book of nature and read from that book and then spoke from that book. And it came through in the languages in which they were speaking in their day and according to the consciousness of their day, but they were all reading from the same book, the book of being. In the Quran and Islam, this is called, it's escaping me right at the moment, the al-Kitab, the mother book. Mother, al-Kitab. And in Islamic theology, the al-Kitab, the mother book, is the book from which the Prophet Muhammad read in the celestial sphere and which got translated into a local language for a specific period into the Quran. But everyone who reads from the mother book has to translate it into the language of their time and culture. And so it comes out different, but it's all coming from the mother book, the al-Kitab, the book of nature, the book of being. Far from not accepting the Quran, we are also ready to recognize the scriptures that others disregard. So we don't reject the Quran, we accept the Quran, but we also accept everything else. So again, he's making a universalist statement for Sufis. As to the Sufi literature, there has never been any book which a Sufi was bound to follow. There's no, Sufi master book, except maybe the al-Kitab, that you were bound to follow. There's no course of study, you have to read this book or that book. And all Sufis, among them the shining ones such as Attar or Shams Tabriz or Rumi or Sadi or Hafiz, have expressed their free thought with complete liberty of language. No one told them what they had to say. Sufism, in the words of Al-Ghazali, is a school of experience, not of dogmas. Sufism does not tell you what you need to believe. It is a path of inquiry, self-inquiry, and of practices that then reveal to you in your own experience what you do believe. And that's an unfolding revelation too, because you'll find that you believe one thing in one period and it continues to unfold in your experience, and then you believe something greater and more expansive over time. So Sufism is just not a school of telling you what to believe, it's a school of experience. To a Sufi, revelation is the inherent property of every soul, which has worked through all stages of the world's evolution and developed in every state of individual evolution. It is, to a Sufi, an unceasing flow of the divine stream which has neither beginning nor end. So, the possibility of revelation belongs to every soul. It's not limited to the so-called prophets or the individual revelations that came through them. Revelation is just available. It just needs to be tapped. And the spring comes up. That doesn't mean that there weren't prophets that came with a powerful revelation. And according to Islamic Sufi teaching, that is always the message of Tawheed, unity. That all the prophets are reading the mother book, whose basic message, rather, is the message of Tawheed, unity. And in the language of Sufism, Wadat al-Wujud, the unity of all being. And that's the message that the mother book is constantly trying to transmit through the various prophets, and they interpret it in the language of their culture and their time, and give some version of that. But it's just there. It's just there. It's the substrate of all existence, of which we're mostly unaware, but just there. And according to one's own stages of evolution, we're aware of it. And the cultivation of one's being over time, we can become more and more aware of it. We can unearth it, as it were. It's just obscured because it's the base reality. So when you clean the mirror of consciousness, it was just obscured by what was, smudging the mirror. All you need to do is clean it, because this is what the truth is. It's the base. Everything else is just an obscuration. So in that sense, one is a Sufi by Safa, becoming, or by Tasawwuf, purifying. And in Sufism, we call that cleansing the mirror of the heart, so that it reflects accurately everything around it, instead of obscuring it or distorting it by what's actually smudging the mirror. It is to a Sufi an unceasing flow of the divine stream, which has neither beginning nor end. The stream is just running. We catch it up with cups, but it's just moving. It's just there. We can participate in its flow or not. No, we can't not participate in its flow, actually. We can't not participate in its flow. But we can have awareness of the flow and thereby participate more in accordance with the flow. We get swept along no matter what. It's what's happening. We do not shut ourselves off from any community, but are ready to unite with all and any, for within we are already united in the infinite. Again, it's the base reality. We can participate consciously or not. If we can participate consciously, then we can move things better. Our order is composed, so order would be tariqa, which means a path. Our path is composed of truth-seeking people of different faiths and beliefs who are not in any way obliged to give up that faith or belief, nor to accept a certain faith or belief, nor are they, if they have none, compelled to adopt one. It's not about these creeds and faiths and beliefs. Sufism is the underlying wisdom. We are united by what unites beneath these distinguishing things. Just as in this room and you know, through this vehicle, we're united by our common humanity. We're a group of humans listening to a talk and talking, you know. I'm not emphasizing that I'm a distinct human who you will never be able to understand, you know, because you don't have my, you know, you haven't had my experience. We're emphasizing the fact that we're going to use this vehicle of communication and our common language and our common humanity to try to bridge that gap. There's a truth to that. You will never know my experience exactly, and I will never know yours. That's not what we're going to emphasize. There is a time to emphasize that when we need to honor the uniqueness of somebody else's experience. But most of the time, and even that unites us, you know, even that emphasis unites us. It's different than saying, I'm different. You'll never get it. You'll never get it. Well, yeah, they never will. They never will in truth, but they never will because you're isolating. As long as we all tread in harmony in the path of love and light, that language is a little overused by now, but no member of this path or order is concerned to inquire into the faith of another. Also, we don't have to make it a big deal. It is not intended that all members of the path should label themselves followers of a certain faith. The members of the path may keep whatever faith or belief they have. It is not even required of them that they should all call themselves Sufi. Who cares? You know, you're doing it or you're not. And the truth is that culturally, in the Middle Eastern culture of Sufis, you didn't call yourself a Sufi. It's become practical in our culture because there are so many different approaches there that are available to us. And somebody says to you, so are you a Sufi? And what is that? And if we were to participate in the Middle Eastern culture, we would say no. And then I'm confused, you were just talking about Sufism. And you, no, I'm not a Sufi. And it will just lead to confusion. So what was intended by that was a statement of humility. If Sufi means pure, I'm not. And so what a Sufi in our culture could say is, yes, you know, in a social situation, you could say, I'm a Sufi. You know, but the fact is Sufi means pure, and all of us who identify as Sufis are really trying to say that we're trying to purify, or that we're aspiring to be Sufis. We aspire to that. Same with Hasidim in Judaism. It means pious. I aspire to that. So he says, it's not even required that you call yourself a Sufi. Who cares? It's about what you're doing, how you're living. With regard to teaching, for a certain way, they are, of course, guided by the Murshid. Murshid means guide. That's the word for a spiritual teacher in Sufism. Sheikh, Pir, Murshid, all are words for a spiritual master, a teacher, rather. Murshid specifically means guide, though. And this is why I like it best. Sheikh means elder. Pir also means elder. And then in Inayati orders, we use Pir for the head of a lineage, under whom there might be many Murshids. But in Sufism generally, Pir, Murshid, Sheikh, and the other titles they're all the same thing. It's just within this lineage we make this distinction for Pir and Murshid. But since Pir and Murshid mean elder in two different languages, Farsi and Arabic, I've always liked to emphasize Murshid because it means a guide. Who couldn't use a guide? It's easy to get lost. You don't know your way around the city, somebody says, it's around the corner. That person's a guide. Everything is a guide to you. He says, so yes, there is a way in which Sufis are guided by a Murshid. But after that has passed, they each have their own path and are the master of their path. Which is to say, it is the function of the guide to introduce you to your own guidance so that you don't need that guide anymore. And this is why I'm always quoting Alan Watts, who made the situation so perfectly obvious. He's, the whole guru culture and the problem with it. He says, imagine you had a doctor who thought it was his job to keep you just sick enough to keep you coming back. It's the function of the doctor to heal you so that you never have to come back. That's the right relative relationship to a guide. That person's objective should be to liberate you from them, to introduce you to your own guidance, to give the transmission that allows you to tune to the one transmission that's being transmitted, perhaps to the Katab, That's the goal. Not to enforce a relationship that is always hierarchical. It doesn't mean that relationship might not always be there. There was never a time where I was with my teacher for 16 years. There was never a time where I thought that I was superior to him or even at his level. But there was a period in which he began to treat me more and more as a colleague. But I never lost the sense that this was an extraordinary being and I wasn't living up to it. And I don't know that that's necessary, but that was a love relationship, and I always felt that I was gaining from that relationship, even though it became more and more nuanced, and I had more and more of my own guidance and clarity. But even in treating me like a colleague, he was liberating me from having to feel obliged to that relationship. I just thought it was funny. I was touched by it, but I thought it was funny for him to treat me like a colleague. But you see what a good teacher he was. He said, I don't have to treat you this way anymore. And he was giving me some of my own. And that teacher does have to give it back to you because in a certain sense you have to give up a little bit in order to become a disciple. You have to voluntarily give some up. And so it's then that person's function to give it back to you, to re-empower you. And that's a good circuit, You yield some so that you can learn because knowledge is like gravity, it operates according to gravity. It comes down. If you want to learn something or receive something, you have to get under it. According to the laws of our universe, you have to get under it. You have to bow a little. If somebody's going to pour from their hand, you have to put your hand under it, catch it. But in the best situation, they give it right back. Question, is Sufism the mystical side of Islam? These people are not getting it. It's like the whole the whole talk and the two answers before. And he says, well, people consider green the color of Ireland, yet it doesn't belong to the Irish. For anybody can wear green, and green is found all over the world. In the same way, mystics in Islam have been called Sufis. But Sufism, divine wisdom, is for all and is not limited to a certain people. This must be getting tiresome for him at this point. Like, how many ways can I say it? It has existed from the first day of creation and will continue to spread and exist to the end of the world. Now here's some questions that show you who this group really was. Do the Sufis believe, as we do, that a world teacher will come and that all this present struggle is going on to pave the way for this coming? A world teacher is coming. And do the Sufis believe as we do? So he's talking to a group that pretty much accepts this idea. The group that was accepting this idea of the coming of a world teacher, a kind of messianic figure from the East, who would become a world teacher, and in a good sense of a kind of world spirituality, not one religion. These were the people of the Theosophical Society in the 1920s, and this is Madame Blavatsky and Annie Besant and the guy, I forgot his name. And when Hazrat Inayat Khan came around, they thought he might be that world teacher from the East. And so as he started giving talks, the Theosophical groups were really attracted to him. And so he was talking to a lot of these people, and they talked like this. They had these assumptions, and many of these people became his students, and then many of these people did not like his answers and went away from him. So, do Sufis believe, as we do, that a world teacher will come, and that should be in all caps, and that this present struggle is going on to pave the way for this coming Messiah, as it were. I've already said that the Sufi is free from beliefs and disbeliefs, and yet gives liberty to people to have their own opinion. Sufis don't believe or disbelieve. They exist with what exists. I personally think if an individual or a multitude believe that a teacher or reformer will come, one will come to them. But at the same time, I say, those who do not believe that any teacher or reformer will come, to them, one will not come. Those who expect a man to come, to them a man will come with a message. Those who wish a woman to come, to them a woman will come and deliver a message. Those who call on God, to them God comes. Those who knock at the door of Satan, Satan answers. There is an answer to every call. To a Sufi, the teacher is never absent, whether the teacher comes in one form or 1,000. The teacher is not even the Murshid. The teacher is the sacred book of nature. Everything is revealing a message to us. Everything. Our entire experience of life is the teacher. So he's trying to disabuse them of this notion of the world teacher. World teacher would be right. The world that teaches. But the world teacher, the messianic figure, says, if you expect that, you'll find one. If you don't expect that, you won't. Expect it to be a man, it'll be a man. Expect it to be a woman, it'll be a woman. You will glom on to whatever it is. And all of those things will be true in a sense. There's nothing that doesn't teach. The teacher is always one to a Sufi. And the same one the Sufi recognizes to be in all. In all teachers, the Sufi sees in the one teacher alone. Mixed up lots of paradox there. Again, they don't leave it alone. Do you expect the coming of a world teacher? Okay, so you gave it this answer. We don't quite get what you're saying. So you say, if I don't expect it, I won't see one. But what if I do expect it? If I do expect it, I will see one. Do you expect one? I'm imagining a sigh now. For a Sufi, the self within, the self without, the kingdom of the earth, the kingdom of heaven, the whole being is the teacher. And the Sufi's every moment is engaged in acquiring knowledge from that teacher. For some, the teacher has already come and gone. For others, the teacher may yet come. But for a Sufi, the teacher has always been and will remain with the Sufi forever. It's the flow. It's just always there. Are you consciously taking a cup and catching it up or not? After, they were disappointed in him for answers like this, they did find a world teacher. This was Jiddu Krishnamurti, who they identified as a young Brahmin boy in India and raised him up to be this world teacher. Problem was that he was a human being, and by the time he got to be a young man, he was like, forget that. And he went off on his own, and he became a powerful teacher, but he left their kind of messianic vision for him. Last question. Why do the awakened ones not awaken people in the world from the sleep of confusion? Would you advise the awakening of little children whose only happiness is in sleep and whose growth depends upon their sleep? If they are kept up late, they'll become ill and are not so useful in the affairs of life as grown-up people. Childhood needs more sleep, and the children must sleep. Such is the nature of the immature. They are children, however old they may appear. Their fancies, their joys, their delights are for unimportant things in life, as the life of children is absorbed in sweets and toys. Therefore, those who are awakened walk slowly and gently, lest their footsteps may disturb the slumber of the sleeping ones. They only awaken on their way those whom they already find changing sides, whose paradigms are already shifting, who are ready to awaken. You just can't awaken the sleeper, not truly. They have to be awakening. And you don't necessarily want to disrupt their process. This may be a problematic example, but it comes to me now. We say democracy is a great thing. I'm saying we in a kind of general America, especially in the Bush administration in the period of the Iraq War. Democracy is a good thing to bring it to those people. They're under a tyrant. Now, there's no doubt that he was. Saddam Hussein was a tyrant and a despot. And yes, in general, democracy, as it's laid out in the principles of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence, are better. We're going to go liberate them from this despot. But it's problematic. If they were not already liberating themselves, they may not have been ready for liberation. If there was not already a movement that was shaking the foundations of his regime, what was going to take hold. Because the consciousness was where it was. And we could try to introduce something into it, but I mean, if we look at this example as if what I'm saying is true, it didn't work. It didn't work. It just seeded other kinds of despotism and released other energies that he was holding down and holding in place. And I'm not saying that wasn't terrible, but by removing him, all we did was remove the cap on those wild energies. We had one kind of despotic thing, and then many things happened. That may work to a good end, but it did seem that the culture and the consciousness of the place, not that there weren't, wonderful and enlightened people within it, but there was not a critical mass yet supporting revolution toward a democratic ideal. And so, removing the cap from that, trying to impose a democratic ideal, did not work. And that may be what he's saying here. You can't impose it. It has to be ready for it. And it's also the same thing where the teacher cannot give the answers, can lead you up to the answers, can talk about them in such a way, and as many ways as possible, until your mind and heart light up around it. You can't make the heart light up around it. And then that's why the teacher has to teach many different ways to see, where the natural opening happens. But that's your opening. You can't give the answers. Somebody has to be ready for that. And that's the only answer that takes hold, is the answer that comes from within. The only one that really grips. So, the wakened walk slowly and gently, lest their footsteps may disturb the slumber of the sleeping ones. And that's not to say that we shouldn't advocate for good change. But it brings into it a modifying consciousness that also perhaps modifies how we act, so that we don't act as if we know the answers and can impose them on culture. We, of course, want to work for the most positive change, but with a healthy humility. We don't make that change. We support it. And we support it most in the places where it's most possible. They only awaken those on their way who they find changing sides. They are the ones to whom the travelers on the spiritual path give their hand quietly. It is for this reason that the spiritual path is called the mystical way. It is not unkind to awaken a few and let many sleep. But on the other hand, it is a great kindness to let those slumber who require sleep. Which is a tough one when we see so much that needs change. And again, I'm not an advocate of a spiritual teaching that would say that there's no such thing as righteous indignation, and that we shouldn't be, powerfully and passionately advocating for change. I think that we should. And where we see injustice, I think we should speak about it and do something about it. And to suffer it to happen is an injustice itself, supported by you, conducted by you. On the other hand, we can't or should not fall into the error of arrogance around that. And it's easy to do. I know what you don't know, and I'm going to tell you what you don't know. This feels wrong. It looks wrong for these reasons. I believe this strongly. I'm convinced of this. but maintaining a healthy humility. It says, but ultimately I don't know. I don't know who you are. I don't know where you're coming from. I want to know. There's a lot of respect in that. We shouldn't forget to respect the other and maintain that sense of healthy unknowing. And realize that people are where they are. And you have to speak to them where they are, not where they're not. So if your consciousness really was in a more expanded state than another person's, then it would be incumbent upon you to go meet them where they are, not to ask them to come meet you where you are. The person with more power bears more responsibility. The person with more knowledge bears more responsibility. And in our culture, maybe among our set of friends, there's a constant demand. Rise up to where we're at. And how many kneel down and humble themselves and learn where somebody else is at and respect where they're at, and learn, what their humanity looks like from that place. And I think that's all that's really missing here. I don't think there's any real sense of spiritual bypassing or not doing something about problems. I don't think that's really being suggested. It's a modifying force that we need to bring into it about how we do it, because it's going to be the only effective way. Otherwise, it's just another revolution that creates another problematic consciousness. A real revolution would be from the inside out. So I think it's a good text, powerful, and I'm grateful for these people's questions, even though they ask the same one over and over. You see how hard it was to make the point, because you see where the consciousness was. It didn't change easily. It didn't matter that he'd given a whole talk that said the opposite. The ideas were fixed. Now, they asked a question, he had to speak to them. And he tried his best to speak in their language and just tease them forward. But they asked it again and again, and then their assumptions. And that's where he had to work. So I think it's a good place to start from. It's not the way I teach it. I usually teach Sufism from the historical foundations, which I think is great also. But he went the complete opposite route and just taught as the underlying wisdom. But that is an authentic Sufi perspective. Sufis will tell you what the historical origins are, unashamedly, but then they'll also say that Sufism has always existed from time immemorial, that there has never been a time when there was awakened human consciousness that there has not been Sufism. From the moment Adam asks the question, who am I and what's this about? There was Sufism. From the moment anyone has an impulse to an expanded awareness or reality or a desire for something greater, bigger than what they know, there is Sufism. And so that's why there's that wonderful quote from Sheikh Muzaffar Ozak. He says, a river passes through many lands, and in each land they call it by a different name, but there's only one river. And that's what the Sufis want to say about Sufism.